Hello, my name is Kat Mayo, and I will be introducing figured bass today. So to get started, I wanted to play an excerpt from an aria by Johann Sebastian Bach. As we listen, I want you to follow along in the score and pay attention to our continuo line. As you listen, I want you to look and see how it's written, how it's notated here, a single melodic line. And I want you to see if it matches with what you're hearing. Now, hopefully, as you listen to this recording, we did have some other instruments playing contrapuntal line against it, but you may have hopefully noticed that there were chords interspersed along with this continuo. And you may have even noticed that as we hit these numbers down here on the bottom, you heard chords or more harmony along with it rather than just the single melodic line in this continuo part. What this is, what's happening here, is figured bass. So the question is, what is figured bass? Well, this is a shorthand way of writing harmony above a single bass line. This is also being called, or is also called, basso continuo and thorough bass. This method of writing precedes Roman numerals. So when we're using figured bass, we're not really worried about chords within a key or chord roots or qualities of chords. We're just really paying attention to, well, we'll find out in a minute. This was used during the Baroque and classical periods. So most of the music that you'd find that uses figured bass like this will be from those two periods. So why use figured bass, or why should we learn about it? Well, the first is, if you're interested in realizing your own figured bass within a Baroque or classical work, that's great. Another reason is we do use it as an analytical tool for figuring out the harmonies of pieces. So figured bass is indicated by the numbers on the bottom of the screen, as you saw in the page before. And these literally, you'll see them right here. So they're indicated by these two numbers here. There can be more than one number. It doesn't have to be just two. But these indicate an interval above the bass note, whatever bass note you're starting on. So in this example, you have the bass note of C with the figured bass 5/3. This means literally we're going to write a fifth above the bass and a third above the bass, which would be E and G. It would be realized something like this. Now, when we realize figured bass, the intervals do not have to be literal. They can, like in our last example, or as in the one here, where you have a C with a 5 and 3, and you make a triad exactly how a fifth and a third would look above it. But these don't have to look like this. They can be doubled or displaced. If we look in this next section, we still have our bass note of C with a 5/3 below it. However, our third is not a third, literally a third above C. It's still an E, but it's an octave above. So we can move these note names around, usually up an octave or two, or we can also double notes. We can double many notes within a chord, but we do follow certain rules that we can talk about later. If we look here, we've displaced both our fifth and our third. Now, if you heard this playing, depending on what instrument is doing it, it might sound a little thin, or it might look something like this, where we've doubled the bass note twice, and we've displaced both the fifth and the third up here. Now, as I said earlier, a figured bass precedes Roman numerals, and when we're using it, we're really not worried too much about chord quality. We're just worried about making sure we get the correct intervals in the correct places above the notes, following the rules that we have for figured bass. So if you'll notice here, we have an F with the figure bass 2, 4, and 7. It might be realized something like this: a second above, a G, a fourth above is B, and a seventh above would be E. Now, if you're trying to put this within a key, well, this doesn't really make up a triad or a seventh chord, as we would think of them within a certain key. We wouldn't write anything with G, B, E, F. Another thing that we can do is, well, when you're using figured bass, it usually stays, or it stays in this key signature contained within the piece, unless it is otherwise shown by use of an accidental in the figured bass. So if you notice here, we have a 4 and a 2, which would indicate a fourth above and a second above. A fourth above would be G, well, the second would be E. The second, though, has a sharp next to it, so that just means we would raise it a half step. So in the key of C, if we are indeed in the key of C, it would just be adding a sharp to that E. Now, if we were in a key where that E was already sharped, it would still show a sharp here in the figured bass. We would just use this as a double sharp there. So now that we've talked about how you would realize figured bass, let's talk about how you might write the figured bass for a given chord. The first thing you'll want to do is narrow down the skeleton of your chord that you're working with. If you take a look at this chord here, we have a C, A, E, A, C. Well, we have some doubled notes in there that we don't really need to worry about when trying to figure out our figured bass. Remember earlier I said when you're reading a figured bass, when you're realizing it, you can double notes as you see fit. And that's what may have happened here if they were playing from figured bass. But we need to eliminate those in order to figure out what our numbers are going to be down here. So if we take all of our doubled notes, we would end up with C, A, and E. Makes an ACE triad. Now it is important to not change the bass note. The bass note must stay there because we're going to look at the other chord tones in relation to that bass note. So if we take our A and E, we have to look at them in relation from the C. So A would be a sixth above C, and E would be a third above C. And so we would write our figured bass as 6-3. If we take a look at this chord, we have A, D, F, A, D. We have several doubled chord tones. So if we take out those doubled chord tones, we'd end up with A, F, A, D, F. So if you want to write this in your figured bass, you see how far those other chord tones are in relation to that A. D is going to be a fourth above, and F is going to be a fifth above. Sorry, a sixth above. So our figured bass would be 6-4. Now earlier, we saw a chord that had a chord tone written that was not indicated by figured bass. This is because with figured bass, we make abbreviations. So we have abbreviations in order to avoid clutter. We are not, in most figured bass, there's not going to be a number for each note. And one of the most important things to know is that when there's not a number or a figure below, you can assume that it's going to be a 5-3. You always assume that 5-3 without a figure. So if we had a G without any numbers down below, we would assume 5-3, which would be a fifth and a third above B, D. So we would have a G, B, D chord. However, if we wanted to indicate something else, we can show that by showing the step above or below one of our 5 and 3. So if we have a G here, we first assume our 5-3 unless it's replaced. Well, our 6 here shows us that we're replacing our 5 with a sixth above. So we know that we are going to have an E above G. But we always assume that 5-3, we cancel out our 5, but we still have our third above. So we're going to have a G, a third above is B, and a sixth above is E. And would look something like this. So that's how you can abbreviate. Those are just a couple of ways that we do abbreviate our figured bass. So now that we've talked about how you can write the chord or realizing figured bass and how you can write the figured bass for a chord, I'd like to take a look at a different excerpt from a Concerto Grosso in D major by Corelli. Now I have two different scores, and you'll notice there is quite a difference, or there's a difference between the two. And one of the main ones is that this one has its figured bass, this one does not. So I said earlier that one of the reasons we would want to know how to realize figured bass is because we may want to play music from the Baroque or classical periods. Now, however, some people may not be very good at realizing figured bass or just not want to take the time. Well, people have taken the time with a lot of these pieces and already realized them and written new scores so that performers are have an easier time of reading it and do not have to realize it themselves. So I wanted to put these side by side. Let's first listen to it and see how it sounds. So hopefully you followed along with the score a little bit. You'll notice that our cello as well as our continuo instrument down here are sharing that duty of realizing the figured bass. There are supporting instruments for our bass lines. Now what I want to do is just look at this first measure or two and compare it to this example here, or the arranged version over here with the realized figured bass. So if we start at the beginning with our first D here, you'll notice that it has no figured bass below it. So we remember that if there's nothing indicated, we usually assume that it's going to be 5/3. In this case, a fifth above D is A, a third above D is F. And we will stay in our same key signature. So if we put an F and an A, we're ending up over here with a D, F, A chord. Same goes for the second note, a D, F, A chord. On our third note, we have a C with a 6 below it. We always assume our 5/3, but 6 replaces our 5/3. We'll have a 6th above C, which is A. We assume our 3 is still there, so we have a C, an E, and an A. If we look over here, that's been realized just like that. Our bass note has stayed the same, C. We have a 6th above it, which is A, F, a third above it, which is E. And same for the second note. Now what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video and take a look at this and and compare it yourself. Go through and look at each note and the figured bass and think about what it might look like, and then quickly come over and compare it for yourself and see if you can make sense of it in your own head, and with a quick check over here. That concludes our short lesson on an introduction of figured bass. I wanted to review quickly what we did talk about. At first, we talked about the fact that figured bass is the shorthand notation method used to show harmonies above a bass line. This was prominently used in Baroque and classical music, although we do use it, we don't use it much in composing music today, but we do use it as an analytical tool. The numbers that are figured bass are there to indicate intervals above the bass line or the bass note. These are not literal, or they do not have to be literal intervals. They can be doubled, or they can be displaced an octave or two above. Figures can be abbreviated to avoid clutter. So if there's a lack of a figure, 5/3 can be assumed, and then 5 or 3 can be assumed, depending on if you have other numbers that would replace them. Finally, When using figured bass, you follow the key signature within the piece, unless otherwise indicated by an accidental along with the figured bass on the bottom. That concludes our lesson for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you learned something.